There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They don't come with warning signs or dramatic music. They just happen, quietly, in the middle of an ordinary Thursday, and by the time you realize what's changed, you're already someone different. I was 26 when I said something I never should have said out loud. Something that started as nothing more than a reflex, the kind of dumb thing guys say when they're comfortable and not thinking. But that one sentence cracked open something I couldn't put back together. And honestly, looking back now, I'm not sure I'd want to. Before I get into it, if this story connects with you, if you've ever had a moment where life blindsided you completely, please take a second to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to Courage Stories. We share real experiences here, and your support means everything. My name is Evan, and this happened 6 years ago in a suburb just outside of Halifax, Nova Scotia. I was renting a room in a house with 2 other guys at the time, working construction during the day and taking project management courses 2 evenings a week through NCC. My life was pretty ordinary. Not bad, not great. The kind of life where you eat leftovers for lunch, text your mom back 2 days late, and tell yourself you'll figure things out eventually. My closest friend was a guy named Claudette Kowalski. We'd known each other since we were 11 years old, back when his family moved from Winnipeg and ended up on my street. We played road hockey together every winter, failed our first driving tests on the same day, and got through high school mostly by looking out for each other. By the time we were adults, Sean was less like a friend and more like a fact of my life. He was just there, the way gravity is there. Sean lived at home to save money. His parents had split up when he was 16, and he'd stayed close with his mom, Claudette Kowalski, ever since. She'd raised him mostly on her own after that, working as a dental hygienist at a clinic downtown, keeping the house running, showing up to every birthday and every terrible decision with the same calm presence. She was 44 when this story happened. I don't mention her age because it's the point. I mention it because it's relevant context for everything that follows. I'd been at their house so many times over the years that Claudette treated me like a second son, mostly. She'd ask how school was going, whether I was eating properly, if I'd talked to my parents lately. Practical stuff. Caring in that understated way some Canadian parents have, where love is expressed through packed lunches left in the fridge and a spare key on a hook by the door, without ever making a big deal about it. I never thought about Claudette as anything other than Sean's mom. I want to be honest about that because the rest of this story requires it. It was a Thursday evening in late October. Sean and I had been watching hockey at his place, the Canadians playing a game neither of us particularly cared about. We were more interested in the wings we'd ordered, and the argument we were having about whether a guy from work had actually quit or just stopped showing up. The kind of conversation that goes nowhere and feels important at the time. Claudette came home from a dinner she'd had with a couple of her friends. She was dressed up a little. Not dressed up in a look-at-me way, but in the way a person dresses when they've made an effort and feel good about it. Dark coat, earrings, hair down. She came through the door laughing at something on her phone, then looked up, said hi to both of us, and went to the kitchen to put on the kettle. Sean made some offhand comment about how she looked like she was going on a date. She called back from the kitchen that it was just dinner, and told him not to be nosy. And then I, without thinking, without any filter whatsoever, said something like, "For what it's worth, she looks better than most of the women I've actually taken on dates." I said it the way you say something when you think it's harmless. A dumb compliment about your friend's mom. The kind of thing that feels like nothing until the room goes quiet. Sean turned and looked at me. Claudette appeared in the kitchen doorway holding her mug. She wasn't angry. That's the thing I wasn't prepared for. I expected embarrassment, or for her to brush it off with a laugh. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not uncomfortable, more like she was deciding something. Then she said, "That's a very kind thing to say, Evan." And then she said, "If you ever want to put your money where your mouth is, I wouldn't say no to dinner sometime." She smiled, walked back into the kitchen. The kettle clicked off. Sean looked at me. I looked at the TV. Neither of us spoke for about 40 seconds. He finally said, "What just happened?" I told him I had no idea. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the night. I drove home with the radio off, replaying the moment in my head like footage I couldn't stop reviewing. I told myself it was just Claudette being witty, deflecting an awkward compliment with a sharper one. That's what I told myself, but I didn't sleep well. Over the next week or so, things at Sean's felt a bit different. Not tense exactly, but charged in a low-level way I couldn't fully explain. Claudette was her usual self around me, friendly and easygoing, the way she'd always been. But there was something in that directness now that I couldn't stop noticing. The way she'd ask me a question and actually wait for the full answer. The way she moved through a room like someone who was very comfortable with herself, something I'd probably always registered but never consciously acknowledged. I started showing up at Sean's a little less. About 3 weeks after that evening, I came by to return a drill I'd borrowed. Sean wasn't home yet from work. Claudette was in the backyard raking leaves, because October in Halifax doesn't mess around, and I offered to help without really thinking about it. We raked leaves for 20 minutes, and somehow ended up talking for close to 2 hours. She talked about a renovation she was thinking about for the downstairs bathroom. I talked about a project I was managing at work that had gone sideways. We talked about Halifax winters, about whether it was worth staying in the Maritimes long term, or eventually moving somewhere warmer, about what our ideas of a good life actually looked like when we got specific about them. She was funny in a dry, observational way that I'd noticed before, but never really paid attention to. She listened without waiting to speak. I drove home that evening aware of something I hadn't wanted to be aware of. I started running into her more often after that. Not planned. Or at least I told myself it wasn't planned. I'd stop by on my way home from a site, or I'd text Sean to ask if he was around knowing there was a decent chance he wasn't. Claudette and I would end up talking in the kitchen or on the back steps, and the conversations kept going deeper in that way that happens when two people are actually curious about each other. She never brought up what she'd said that night. Neither did I, but it was always there, like a sentence neither of us had finished. About 6 weeks after the leaf-raking afternoon, she said something that I've thought about many times since. We were standing outside by her car. It was getting dark early the way it does in November. She said that she'd spent so many years making decisions based on what made sense on paper that she'd sometimes forgotten to ask herself what she actually wanted. She said she didn't think life owed her anything, but she also didn't think she owed life an apology for wanting something real. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. Or she was, but not in a pointed way, just honestly. I went home and sat in my kitchen for a long time. The following Saturday, I asked Sean if we could talk. I want to be clear about how hard that conversation was. Sean and I had been friends for 15 years. He was the person I called when I got rear-ended on the 102 and didn't want to sound panicked calling my parents. He was the person who drove 4 hours to pick me up when a camping trip went badly wrong. Our friendship wasn't something I could have described in a few sentences, because it had accumulated over so many years of small things that it had become part of the structure of my life. I told him that something had been happening, that I hadn't gone looking for it, and that I respected him too much to let it go on without being straight with him. I told him I thought I had feelings for his mother. He stared at me for a long time. Then he laughed. Not a real laugh. A short, disbelieving sound that wasn't quite anything. He asked me if I was serious. I told him I was. He asked me to leave. I left. The weeks that followed were the quietest stretch I've had in my adult life. Sean didn't return my texts. I didn't push it. I understood. There's no rule book for what I'd told him. No script where the other person is supposed to say, "No problem. Glad you told me." He needed to be angry and I was the appropriate target. Claudette and I didn't speak either. I think we both understood that wasn't the right move. I kept going to work, going to class, eating leftovers, but there was a low-level grief running under everything. The loss of something I'd had for 15 years and didn't know how to live without. Not just the friendship. The ease of it. The way Sean and I never had to explain ourselves to each other because there was so much shared history that explanation was never necessary. I missed that more than I expected to. Around 2 months in, I ran into Claudette at a superstore on a Sunday morning. We were both buying groceries. It was the first time I'd seen her since everything had come out, and for a second we both just stood there in the cereal aisle not knowing what to say. She asked how I was doing. I said honestly, not great. She nodded and said she wasn't either. She said Sean was working through it, that he was more complicated about it than he was letting on, which is how he processed things, she said. By being angry first and honest later. She said she was sorry things had gotten difficult. I told her she hadn't done anything that needed an apology. We talked for maybe 15 minutes leaning against our carts in the cereal aisle. She was tired around the eyes, but she was still herself, direct and warm and not performing anything. Before she left, She said one thing that stayed with me. She said she wasn't the kind of person who chased things, but she also wasn't the kind of person who pretended she didn't want them. She said she'd let me figure out what I wanted, and that she'd respect whatever that was. Then she pushed her cart toward the dairy section, and I stood there next to the granola for probably too long. 4 months after that conversation with Sean, I was sitting in my truck outside the Tim Hortons on Roby Street, waiting for a coffee order, when my phone rang and it was him. His voice was different, flatter somehow, quieter than angry. He talked for a while before getting to the point. He talked about how weird it had been at home, about noticing things he hadn't noticed before. His mom eating dinner alone most nights, her going to bed early on weekends because there was nothing to stay up for, how she'd put in so much of herself into raising him that she'd kind of stopped having her own life somewhere along the way, and he'd never really thought about it because it had always just been the backdrop of his. Then he got to the point. He said that if I hurt her, he would never forgive me, and that he meant it literally, not as a figure of speech. And then he said that if I actually cared about her the way it seemed like I did, then maybe he was going to have to get used to something he hadn't expected. I didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. I thanked him. He told me not to thank him yet. He hung up. I sat in my truck until the coffee was cold. The first time Claudette and I had dinner together, just the two of us with no accidental context around it, was in early spring. We went to a place in the North End, a small restaurant she liked that I'd never been to, one of those spots with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and the kind of food that actually tastes like something. We were there for almost 3 hours. She told me things she hadn't told me during any of our kitchen conversations, about her marriage, how it hadn't ended badly so much as slowly, the way certain things just lose pressure over time until there's nothing left to hold them up, about what she'd imagined her life would look like at 44 versus what it actually looked like, about the things she was still curious about, travel she wanted to do, a ceramics course she kept putting off, what she thought about when the house was quiet. I told her about growing up, about the gap between who I thought I'd be by now and who I actually was, in a way I'd never really said out loud to anyone. At some point she laughed at something I said, and I noticed the way her whole face changed when she laughed, and I thought, there it is. There's the thing I was trying to talk myself out of. That was 4 years ago now. The road between that dinner and where we are now wasn't straight. There were Sean's birthdays, which were uncomfortable in the first year in ways that took patience to sit through. There were family events where I wasn't sure how to stand or what to call myself. There were moments when the age difference was something other people felt the need to comment on, sometimes kindly, sometimes not. But Sean came around, not all at once, not in a single moment. It happened gradually, the way most things that actually last tend to happen. He'd text me about a hockey game. We'd grab lunch after a shift. Last Christmas, the three of us drove out to Peggy's Cove together and stood in the cold looking at the lighthouse, and somehow it just felt ordinary, in the best way. There's a moment I keep coming back to. It was about a year after Claudette and I made things official. We were all at a family dinner at her sister's place in Dartmouth, and at some point during the evening, Sean leaned over to me while we were washing dishes and said, "She's happier. I don't know if I've seen her actually happy like this before." He didn't say anything else. He handed me a pot to dry. That was it. It was enough. Claudette and I moved in together about 8 months ago. It hasn't been simple. Two people with fully formed lives don't just merge without friction. We have different rhythms, different ideas about how a kitchen should be organized, different tolerances for clutter. We've had arguments that required actual repair afterward, but we've gotten good at repairing. She finally signed up for that ceramics course. I went with her to the first class because she was nervous, which surprised me, because she's not someone who is visibly nervous about things. She made something that looked like a slightly flattened bowl and declared it a triumph, and honestly, she wasn't wrong. Last month, Sean helped us move a bookshelf. He complained about the weight of it the entire time, the way he complains about everything physical, which is one of the things about him that hasn't changed since we were 11. Claudette made coffee afterward. The three of us sat at the kitchen table and talked until it was dark. Before I go, I want to ask you something. If you've ever had a moment where life handed you something you didn't expect, something that forced you to rethink what you thought the rules were, leave a comment below. Write the word unexpected, because honestly, the stories that have shaped me the most never came with a warning. They just showed up, the way this one did, on an ordinary Thursday, in a house I'd been to 100 times before. If this story stayed with you, please give it a like, share it with someone who believes that real things happen in unexpected places, and subscribe to Courage Stories. I'll see you in the next one.